quality done right is your best friend. Many people look at quality organizations as, oh no, not another SOP. But when you do quality right, it saves you so many headaches down the line. It can save you from yourself, from making mistakes that will trip you up further down the line. I always would advocate for, once you have the resources, having quality internal rather than outsourcing it so that you've got somebody there all the time.
Hey, smart biotech scientists, welcome back. We are in the middle of an exciting conversation about the differences between big pharma and small biotech startup companies. What are the differences? What are the advantages? And how does the culture differ? My today's guest is Mark Melville, who is the Vice President of CMC Biologics at Cullinan Therapeutics. He began his career in large biotech companies and later shifted to smaller startups. He now works in a virtual setting, outsourcing all development and manufacturing. And today, we are continuing our journey and we're talking especially about the outsourcing of development and manufacturing. And if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, please go back and listen to that part first. And please tell us what you think about part 1 of this conversation. You can do so by leaving a review. I look forward to hearing from you, and now stay tuned for part 2 of our conversation with Mark Melville. Are you juggling the complexities of CMC development while trying to enjoy the beauty of biotech? Have you ever wondered if there's a way to simplify bioprocessing? Welcome to the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast, where we're diving headfirst into the very challenges you face. We're breaking it down, demystifying the jargon, and giving you the keys to unlock your full potential. I'm your host, David Brohlman, and I get it. With 15 plus years in the biotech industry, I face the same challenges you do. There's a way to simplify and streamline so you can remove complexity, you can skip trials and errors, deliver without delay your groundbreaking therapy to clinics at market, and still enjoy every single step. Do you want to learn how industry experts and I did it? Grab a cup of coffee and your favorite notebook and pen. Now is the time to take your bioprocessing game to the next level. Let's smarten up biotech. Now, in a smaller company, what's very different is that you have limited resources, so you can't do it all. How do you make strategic decisions? Or in other words, how do you prioritize what you're working on? Are there like a few simple hacks, or is it every time different, or what have you noticed working in this environment?
It's kind of the same as we were just talking about, the transparency that we have across our departments and across our functions, and constant awareness of what the long-term goals of the company. That is what helps us to prioritize our own competing needs. So whether your pipeline is slim or broad, you're always going to have competing interests. And so when you're a small company looking across your pipeline, some programs more than others are going to be driving the value of your company. And so we adjust our priorities based on the overall priority of the company itself. And what does the company need? What do the programs need in the end to be able to deliver to patients? In the end, that's what's driving our priorities as a company, is what's best for patients. And that all just trickles back into how we prioritize the work that we do with a given program, with a given vendor. We're constantly exposed to it.
Can you give us a specific example, just to help us or help our listeners understand how you did that?
Yeah, I can tell you a story. This isn't with my current company, but a while back I was making biosimilar products. And the product that was furthest along in development had been initiated before any of us at the company had joined. We had inherited this program. And pretty early on, so I was one of the first, there were 2 CMC people that were hired, myself and another colleague. And not long after we joined the company, we discovered that there was a potential problem with the product that we were making. And it turned out, after we did a lot of investigative work, a lot of protein analysis, peptide mapping, and some pretty sophisticated genetic forensics, that the technology that was used to generate the cell line was utilized gene amplification or inserting multiple gene copies in order to improve productivity. And it turned out that we were making an antibody, and one copy of about 20 copies of the heavy chain contained a point mutation. So there was a single amino acid change in a very small fraction of the protein. We were moving towards regulatory filings. We were moving towards getting clinical studies started, and we didn't know how the regulatory agencies were going to receive this. So we sought advice from consultants, both in the EU and the US, to give their perspectives on how the regulatory agencies would receive this and if it would affect our ability to file. And so the first critical decision that was made there was by our senior management was to follow the advice of the consultants, which was to proceed. We had a position that we thought we could defend in a regulatory filing to the agencies. It was well controlled and there was no risk to patients. That decision was driven by the need for speed. It's a risky decision to move forward with a known issue like that, although our arguments were pretty sound. If you consider, say, deamidation, which is very commonly happens in therapeutic proteins, that results in an amino acid change. So this wasn't really any different from that. Anyway, but that was the first critical decision. That was driven by speed. So we needed to get to the clinic, so we decided to move forward. And that's something I don't think a large company would probably not make that same decision because it is risky. A second critical decision that was made was to have a backup plan. And that was really, I think, driven by, we would not have done that if we did not have real CMC representation in the company. And that goes back to what something I mentioned early on in our discussion, that the ability to assess risk is something that can be underappreciated in people that are not really directly involved in this and doing this work. And so we understood the risk that we were taking and communicated that to our senior management. And the decision there was to develop a backup strategy, which was to go in and knock the gene out that contained the mutation, which we did. And that work went on in the background. It turned out it was a good thing we did because the regulatory agencies, although they agreed that the product was fine, they refused to accept that it fit the definition of a biosimilar because it contained this mutation. But we had the backup strategy in place. And so we were able to move on from there. Two critical decisions there, one driven by speed and the other driven by having the right expertise in the company at the time.
Yeah, smart biotech scientists, this is an important skill to have, the ability to assess risks, because we work in a risky business and bioprocess development is risky. Let's shift gear a bit, Mark, because you have been in the virtual setting for many years. And can you tell us what are the main advantages and disadvantages of outsourcing all development and manufacturing?
One big advantage that's maybe pretty obvious or common sense to most people is if things are not going well with a vendor, you can change. It's not easy. It can be time consuming and expensive, but it is an option. Whereas at a large company, it's not like you can fire an entire department if they're not performing. You have an ability with a small company with outsourcing that you don't have when you have the internal resources. As well, I think going with that, or another advantage, especially today, and at my current company, we're agnostic to the types of molecules that we develop. If you're in that type of setting where your pipeline might consist of a small molecule, an antibody, a peptide, cell therapy or something, I don't know. But there's so many different modalities out there. Certainly a small biotech is really hard to conceive of how you would have all of that internal. So outsourcing that, you can go to the best vendors for a particular purpose if one is better at one type of molecule than another. Disadvantage is you lose an element of control for sure. You lose time. You don't have the ability to react in the same way. We gain a lot of advantage with speed being a small biotech, but some of that is sacrificed when you're outsourcing because if you have a new experiment that you need to do or a new program, you have to set up the contract, negotiate the terms, and then they assign resources. And by definition, my goals and the goals of my vendors are not fully aligned. They're a money-making business and they have a number of customers. I want to be their most important customer, but that's not always going to happen. Say those are the disadvantages.
Now, speaking of control, how do you ensure quality control and regulatory compliance? Because this is key in our industry.
For that, rely very heavily on our partners in quality, in QA, and in regulatory. And those are essential, I think. They create sort of a a triumvirate of what you need in order to be successful in bioprocess development. You have your CMC, you have quality, and you have regulatory. So when it comes to our external vendors, rely very heavily on our quality organization, whether you're contracting in quality people or you've built your own quality group. You rely on them to establish a well-crafted quality agreement with your vendors, which provides all of the initial evaluation and oversight, and then have a robust maintenance and audit plan to make sure that you're always up to date with your vendors. So the quality agreement really does a lot of the heavy lifting to help you stay informed about what else is going on at that company. Make sure you get informed when they're subject to regulatory inspections and that kind of thing. And then on the regulatory side, it's more about making sure that our regulatory groups are aligned with the work that we're doing, CMC and quality are doing. But the main touch point with the external vendors is with quality.
Now, here's the $1,000,000 question. Do you outsource quality or do you keep it in-house?
There's a pattern that I've seen when it comes to small biotechs, and I've worked in several now. First comes the CMC people, so contractors and then hires. CMC will often trigger the quality hires. That's what I've experienced, is that we have to have quality people in here. We need to bring in quality now. In my experience, it's typically a stage thing. You will begin with contractors, so you'll outsource quality. There's a lot of options out there these days for quality. You can buy entire sets of SOPs to establish a basic quality system at your organization. But once you grow large enough, you really need to have your own group. And especially if you have a broad pipeline, you've got a lot of clinical programs. I can't speak really to clinical quality, but that is a really important component as well for a small company. And I would suspect gets overlooked almost as much as CMC, as GMP quality. A lesson that I took from one of my first small biotech jobs is quality done right is your best friend. Many people look at quality organizations as, oh no, not another SOP. But when you do quality right, it saves you so many headaches down the line. It can save you from yourself, from making mistakes that will trip you up further down the line. I always would advocate for, once you have the resources, having quality internal rather than outsourcing it so that you've got somebody there all the time.
Now, great partners are great, but if you have the wrong partners, they can make your life very difficult. So what are the main criteria we should keep in mind when selecting external service providers?
I think that can really vary depending on the stage of your company and what your particular needs are. So I will confess that I've co-opted a pretty exhaustive spreadsheet to use for vendor selection. A former colleague of mine, he might have stolen it from someone else, I don't know, but I use dozens of criteria when selecting a vendor to try to make it the most objective decision that we can. What you need from a particular vendor in these dozens of criteria, some are more important than others, some are weighted more heavily than others. But there are a few that I think will be constant regardless of any particular need you have. And so some of the constants are cost is always important and needs to be considered. If you can negotiate costs, it's even better. And that's not always possible for a small company. What I look for, even if I'm far from a commercial product, is what is their regulatory history? How have they been inspected and what kind of products have they made? Ideally, somebody that has commercial experience is going to have the most exposure to regulatory agencies. They will have been inspected. When I think about development at a small biotech, it's most likely going to be the case that if you're successful, it's most likely going to be the case that the company or the product will be acquired. You won't take it all the way to the market. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't consider the long-term needs of the program. You don't want to put a program in a position where it's unattractive for another company to acquire. So putting things with vendors that can take them all the way to the commercial market, I think, is important. And then maybe the most important criteria is really the feel of the company, the vibe of the company. That's around how, again, going back to communication, how do they communicate with you? What's their approach to program management and communication? What's my access? Personally, I don't want to be funneling everything through a program manager, but this is a criteria that's going to have a different correct definition for everybody. But it is important to consider, how do you want to interact with the company that you're going to be contracting with? And how does it feel when you're on site visiting them? Do they sort of match your communication style and what you need from them or not? It's a very subjective criteria, but I think it's a very important one to consider because you're going to be working with these companies a lot. So you need to feel good about the interaction.
Yeah, you're right. The relationship is key. And I recently did an episode on stakeholder management. And so I'm wondering, what is your experience, Mark? How do you establish and then maintain strong relationships? Because they will define whether the project is successful or not.
Everybody will have their own approach to it, I think. But for me, the way that I try to accomplish this is approaching the relationship as a collaboration rather than as a service provider. As a small biotech, I don't have the clout to demand high quality service and any kind of prioritized treatment or something like that. I don't have the money and I'm not going to give them a pipeline of a dozen programs over 10 years. I have to rely on other means. And the way I do that is through approaching this as a collaboration. And what I mean by that is I like to work with the team at the CDMO as if they're an academic collaboration partnership. On my side, when I build my teams, I hire SMEs in particular areas so that we're contributing to the scientific discussions and are contributing to problem solving. We want to hear about the technical difficulties. And so we're involved, but we're not dictating either. I want to work with companies that are also contributing their own scientific expertise. You pay a lot of money to service providers, and if you're just paying for hands, it's not a good use of your money, in my opinion. I think you want to leverage as much as you can their own scientific expertise. And I think that does the added advantage of these people are all scientists. The people that are working on your program are all scientists. They like being engaged. They like challenges. They like talking about this stuff. We're all nerds about the science that we're doing. So if we work together as collaborators, I think we get a lot more out of the teams that we're working with. So it's about engaging the individuals or the scientists on the team. And when they're engaged, when they're really feeling the program, they're feeling like they're being respected for the scientific acumen that they bring, I think you get more back. They make the extra effort with your program. They give it that extra thought that might solve a particular problem. So you get more out of it than if you treat them as if they're just a service provider. Here's the experiment I want you to do it, bring the results back to me. And the other advantage that I think you get out of that is if you establish that collaboration, again, going back to transparency, I think I tend to explain a lot more about our programs to our vendors than they really need to know in order to execute the program, but that gets them invested in it. And what that also gets them to do is to think more like me. So when there is an issue that comes up or a decision that needs to be made, they're more likely to make the decision that I would make because, as I mentioned before, we're not always aligned on our goals. And by having that collaborative relationship, they will be more aligned with my goals than just serving the contract as it's written out.
Yeah, smart biotech scientists, this is excellent advice. Approach it as a collaboration. You will get a lot more out of it. As we are wrapping up, Mark, what advice would you give a young biotech scientist who's at the start of their career, whether they should start in a big company or a small company? Any quick advice?
Ironically, as much as I love a small company, I think a large company is the better way to go to start out. Because at a small company, you won't get that hands-on bench experience. And I think that's, for me anyway, and for the teams that I build, it's an essential part of our success, is understanding how to do the work and what goes into the work. I think if you don't have that understanding, it makes it more difficult to manage the work that's being outsourced. Because if you don't understand how long it takes to do an experiment, or you don't understand the difficulties that go into it, when you run into challenges, it really makes it tough to navigate those. So I think having that bench experience is essential.
What is the most important takeaway from our conversation today, Mark?
If I didn't say it enough, communication. That was something I really learned as I started expanding my career in small biotech and outsourcing. Is communication is so essential. Communication within your company, with all your key stakeholders, communication with your vendor network, because there's a peculiar thing or a unique thing that can happen in a small company, in a lean company, where you can have an individual person that has a piece of information. And if you don't communicate that, that piece of information can die with you. If no one ever hears it, then no one knows. And that tends not to happen at a large company because you function in a group. Individuals can hold really key information at a small company. And so communicating that, making sure that The right people know the right information at the right time. That is really key to success, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing all of your insights, your experience. Where can people connect with you?
Probably LinkedIn is the best spot.
All right. I will leave the info in the show notes, so please reach out to Mark. And thank you once again for being on the show today, Mark.
Thank you so much, David. This was really a pleasure.
Hey, smart biotech scientists. Thank you so much for tuning in today. What did you think about today's episode? Please tell us by leaving a review. And I look forward to hearing from you. And also, if you have any questions or comments, just reach out. I love hearing from you. And perhaps you're working in a smaller company or even in a startup and you don't have the CMC expertise in-house, or you're not so sure about the right CMC development strategy or whether you should outsource certain activities. I want to help you get clarity on that, and to do this, I offer you a free 30-minute assessment. Just book a call using the link down in the show notes, and I'll see you in the call so that you can master your CMC development. All right, smart scientists. That's all for today on the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast. Thank you for tuning in and joining us on your journey to bioprocess mastery. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. By doing so, we can empower more scientists like you. For additional bioprocessing tips, visit us at smartbiotechscientist.com. Stay tuned for more inspiring biotech insights in our next episode. Until then, let's continue to smarten up biotech.